Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work.
Good evening, my wildlings. When you think back on your childhood, what do you remember most about your hometown? Is it your old stomping grounds, the people who mattered most to you? Or is it something you don't want to remember? Such is the case in tonight's tale, Mr. Trenchfoot, by Macaroni Art Zombie. I know the topic of scary or rather disturbing stories from our childhoods are outdated and considered cliché, but I thought that you might like this one. It was from my high school years. See, I wasn't always rebellious. In fact, I was a good kid. Wasn't what you'd call an angel of a child, but I was still keeping up appearances, had good grades, I was disciplined enough, and I had pretty well-developed manners. I hung out with this delinquent, Cody. He wasn't such a good kid. He was an asshole, the biggest one you'll ever meet. Nobody really liked him, but he was quite wealthy, and when his parents were away, he would throw huge parties that half of the 10th grade students from my high school would go to. I was always invited to these, but he always started the parties late at night, around midnight. His last party had, at least, which meant my parents wouldn't let me go to the next one, so I didn't even bother asking. I know it wasn't in my nature, and now that I look back, it was a really stupid choice, but I decided that for that one, I'd sneak out. My dad stayed up till 11 every night and never emerged from his bedroom until the following morning, and my mom always slept till noon, using beauty sleep as an excuse. Time came, night of the party. It was about 11:30, and my dad had already stumbled into his bedroom and proceeded to snore loudly. I slowly twisted the handle of my door to reveal the inky blackness of the hallways. Now would be the perfect time to escape, and if not now, never. Cody lived pretty far away, and it would take at least an hour to get there by foot. I softly closed my door and lightly paced towards our sliding glass door. Opening it slowly, it must have been a minute before there was an opening big enough for me to squeeze through. And once I was through, I took no risk and took another minute to close it again. Now outside, the moon illuminated the ground quite well. I lived in a desert area, and there were really no threats at night save for coyotes, but they rarely attacked people. I kept a pocket knife on me, however. The coyotes were usually more scared of you than you were of them, but this was just a precaution. You can't ever be too careful. There were also a fair amount of shady people for such a small town, but that really didn't worry me. The terrain in that part of town was rugged and difficult to navigate. I had to dodge tall brush and jump over eroded crevices in the earth. I checked my watch and saw it was around 12:15. I knew I must be close because I saw a familiar house that I always passed by while walking on the sidewalk to get to Cody's house. Only a couple more blocks and I would have made it. The terrain had gotten surprisingly less jagged and quite a bit smoother after a couple of minutes. The ground was mainly free of rocks and other obstructions, save for beer bottles and some dried-up bushes. But there was one thing that caught my eye. There was a torn brown tarp lying next to the side of the ditch I was walking through. I stopped for a moment and just looked at it before my curiosity managed to claw its way through my head, and I slowly approached it. It was probably just trash, but for some reason I felt inclined to see what it was. Nudged it with my foot, and a tall figure rose swiftly from under the cover. I was knocked back, frozen with fear. It was a bear-like creature that wore a dark brown trench coat and dusty brown pants. He was barefoot, and his feet were larger than any creature that I'd seen before. This thing stood up. He had to have stood higher than 6'5", towering over me. Long white hair protruded from every visible inch of its body, almost like an animal. Its glossy eyes met mine, and I was ready to run. But I managed to stutter out a few words. I stopped examining the creature once more. "What are you?" The figure looked at me again and let out a hearty chuckle. He wiped a few tears of joy from under his eyes and gave me a smile. "Why, my boy, I am Mr. Trenchfoot," he said, still grinning at me. His tone was nothing short of friendly, and that was the only thing that stopped me from making a mad dash back to my house. He gave me a puzzled look and asked, "Do you by any chance know the date?" I thought he was joking at first, and even laughed a bit. Then I saw his serious expression. I stuttered again, but managed to collect myself. It's June, June 7th, I said. He looked shocked, or rather intrigued. He looked at me again, and my eyes met his once more. My, I have been asleep quite a long time. It was November the last time I was awake," he said, still sounding jovial. "Now tell me, what have I missed?" We got into quite a conversation, even though it was a little strange, and it lasted a good 15 minutes. He asked me about politics and celebrities, but nothing too serious. We continued to speak for a while until I looked down at my watch and noticed the time. I had about 16 minutes to get to Cody's before it hit 1. I sat up from the rock on which I'd previously rested and said, "I have to get going." Mr. Trenchfoot stood up and wiped dirt off his coat and coughed before speaking. He walked towards a storm drain that seemed to lead into the blackness. "Please, come, follow me," he said, entering it. "I need to show you something." His voice was all too friendly and quite inviting. He crawled farther into the pipe, and soon he was enveloped in darkness. I dared not enter and stood there. He turned, and the only reason I know this is because a little bit of moonlight illuminated his eyes, just as it would a dog's or a cat's. I stepped back a bit, a little frightened, and reminded him that I had to go. "Come here," he said softly. He repeated it, and each time it got more angered and menacing. "Come here. Come here. Come here!" He inched forward just enough so that I could see him fully. Long, black claws protruded from his fingers. He clawed the sides of the tunnel as he repeated, "Come here now. Come here now." I ran as fast as I could back up the side of that ditch I was walking in, not daring to look back and see if he was following until I was at a safe distance. After about a minute solid of running, I looked back, and I was relieved, as he hadn't followed. He stood, watching, as the moon outlined his figure. I continued to run as fast as I think I ever have. I hopped over my fence, this time not cautious of making any noise, and ran inside, tired and frightened. My dad had heard my entrance, and came down to see what the cause of the noise was. I'd explained something had tried to attack me, and he called the police without hesitation. I explained to the cops where it had happened and what I'd seen. It was apparently a slow night because they wasted no time in rushing to the area to investigate. However, no sign of Mr. Trenchfoot turned up. I was at the scene watching them at a safe distance with my mom and dad. I had shown the chief the drain pipe that Mr. Trenchfoot had tried to lure me into. He motioned several armed men inside that pipe, and they didn't find him though, and they still haven't, not even to this day. That was my story. Creepy, right? Things got back to normal. I got grounded for a couple of weeks, but they let me off because they were just glad that their little boy was safe. So you can say that this had a happy ending, for me at least. Still, I haven't told you the the best part. You know how I said they didn't find him? Well, when they kicked open a grate, they entered a concrete room, no bigger than a walk-in closet. Again, they didn't find Mr. Trenchfoot in there. However, they did find something. They found the tarp in there, still as dusty as ever. There was no sign of Mr. Trenchfoot, or of any life for that matter. There was another thing in the room. In the far corner of the dark, cold concrete shelter was a pile of bloody, torn clothes, all of them belonging to missing children from the town, some of which going back the last 20 years. So even though we humans think of ourselves as the top of the food chain, that doesn't mean that there aren't predators out there. Be careful, kids. Stay scary, my wildlings, and make the most of your nights.